All right, guys, we're going to talk today about populations of species today and some of the interactions, a little bit about the graphing that's related to this. Now, we're going to talk about populations here with respect to plants and animals, but of course, we're going to spend a whole unit talking about human population and its effects on the environment a little bit later on. So we'll briefly mention that in this. So if you remember back to the beginning of the year, a population is basically a group of interbreeding individuals that are the same species. And so this group of seabirds here is a population altogether. They're all able to interbreed with each other, and particularly they're all in a specific area. Okay, so usually when we refer to a population, we're talking to a particular habitat or a particular ecosystem or a particular sub-area within a biome. So those populations, they have what we call dispersion patterns, and so it's, do they stay together or are they in different areas? So for a lot of species, what they do is they tend to live in clumps. Now there are lots of advantages to this living in clumps. If one of them finds resources like food or water, then they're all going to have access to it. Obviously they're going to be able to fight off predators a lot more. When mating season comes around, they're all pretty close together, and so there's some distinct advantages to that clumping. A couple other dispersion patterns, if resources are limited, then it is often very helpful for things to uniformly disperse themselves. And so these are creosote plants. It's kind of hard to see in this picture here, but basically they space themselves out almost at like these exact spacing intervals. And so it's a really sort of uniform sort of system. A lot of grasses do that same sort of thing. And then random dispersion would be, if you look at these dandelions, there's no real order to where they are. Or to where they're growing. Of course, it just sort of depends on where did the wind disperse the seeds to and were there nutrients there when it got dispersed there. So those are three dispersion patterns that we're going to see in populations: clumping, uniform, and random dispersion. This next slide, we have a sort of an overall equation for population and population change. And so that equation is going to be here. You need to sort of keep this in the back of your mind, not just now, but when we talk about human populations a little bit later on. So population change basically depends on four variables. And those four variables are births and immigration. Okay, so the more births you have, that's going to increase your population. The more immigration, now immigration, remember, means coming into an area. Now we tend to think of it as coming into a country, but coming into an ecosystem or a biome or a particular habitat, that's immigration. Those things are going to cause positive population change. And then the other part of it is deaths and emigration. Emigration would mean, of course, leaving that particular ecosystem, whether it's being pulled out intentionally, and this should actually, right here, this should be a plus right there. So deaths and emigration together get subtracted from the population change because those are individuals that are leaving the population, whether they're leaving just that ecosystem or whether they're dying off and actually leaving the earth as a whole. So if you take those things and you add up your births and immigration, and then you add up your deaths and immigration, and you subtract the negative stuff here from the positive stuff, then that's going to give you your overall population change. And those, of course, are four variables that matter for population change: births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. Now that leads us to something called an age structure. This is an age structure diagram. This is actually the human population of Finland. And so you can sort of see here the different age groups. Now what's kind of important here is we could kind of split this up into sort of three categories. And our three categories would be, so we've kind of got in this area here, these first three bars, this is what we call a pre-reproductive age. And then we would have sort of a post-reproductive age that would probably be somewhere around here. Maybe we could probably leave that blue one off. Or I'm sorry, a reproductive age is what's in the middle there. And then a post-reproductive age here at the end. Sometimes we categorize these and we think like young and mature and elderly, particularly if we're talking about human populations. But we're talking about plants or animals. We're talking pre-reproductive. They're not mature enough to reproduce yet. Reproductive means that they can reproduce, and then post-reproductive means that they're past the age at which they can reproduce. And of course, for some species or for humans, this is more complicated because obviously males can be reproductive past the time the females are reproductive, and so obviously that's going to lead to some skewing sometimes of our demographic information. So those are three categories: pre-reproductive, reproductive, post-reproductive. And what happens is how these affect your population is it depends on which things you have more or less of. And so if you have a large number of your population in the reproductive area or close to the reproductive age, then you're probably going to see a really high population growth. And so like in a lot of developing countries where you don't have a lot of elderly because the mortality rate, maybe they're going to, most individuals are going to die off before they're, say, 40 years of age, then that means that most of their population doesn't make it to the post-reproductive age. And so they're going to have a pretty high growth rate, and therefore their population is probably going to go up a lot. On the other hand, if you've got a pretty high number of post-reproductive, like say in Japan right now, your population is likely to decline. This is actually true in a lot of Europe as well, is that you've got a lot of post-reproductive population, and so therefore your population is probably going to go down. Now, there are social factors that come in here as well. So like for human populations, if people are choosing to have children later, obviously then that's going to sort of skew this data a little bit as far as growth and decline. Now, what's important is that for populations to live, we have what we call a range of tolerance. And what that means is that given certain factors, okay, so like for plants, like sunlight and nutrients and water, for animals, food sources, shelter, mating ability, all of those things are factors that play into this thing called a range of tolerance. So if we take a particular factor, like one factor, so in our example here, we're going to take the water temperature for the fish, then you've got what we have a range of tolerance. And you'll see that we have sort of our typical bell curve here. And so there's an area in the middle. This is this light blue area. This is what we call the optimum range, or the optimum range of tolerance, which means that this is where they would prefer to live. There's a certain temperature range that a certain species of fish in a certain habitat is going to do really well in. This is where it's going to be able to reproduce really well. You're going to get large numbers of the population. And then off in these purple areas, you have what we call the zone of stress, or sometimes you'll hear it called the zone of physiological stress, which would mean that when they're in this area, they can survive. They're alive. It's not killing them off, but it might hamper their reproduction. They might not be able to reproduce as much, or they might purposely not reproduce as much because they're not going to be, their offspring are not going to be able to survive as well in that zone of stress. And then at either end, you've got a zone of intolerance. So if the temperature goes up too much or if it goes down too much, those fish aren't going to be able to survive at all. And so they're basically out of the range of tolerance. So the purple and blue together here is the tolerant area. That's where they can live. And then within that, there's a smaller area that is the optimum range. That is where each species basically has temperature and food source and shelter, and all of those things are like fish, dissolved oxygen levels, salinity levels, all of those things come into play, all of the factors. And so there's a range of tolerance for each individual factor for each individual species. And so some species might be able to withstand a higher salinity level or a higher acidity level of the water, whereas another type of fish or something might not be able to survive that. And so that would change where the optimum range is for that particular factor. So that leads us to the idea that we can have a limiting factor, okay? In other words, if we look back at our zone of tolerance here, if we've got too little temperature or too much temperature, okay, then that inhibits growth. Growth of the population as a whole. It might actually kill off the individuals also. But in particular, it's going to limit the population overall. And that is even if everything else was great, like even if there was a lot of food, there weren't many predators, if the water temperature was too high or too low, then those fish aren't going to be able to survive. And so in chemistry, we would say that this is what your limiting factor is what determines how much you get in the end. And that's true in ecology as well, that your limiting factor determines sort of what your overall population can be. If you've got one factor that's outside of the zone of tolerance, then you're not going to be able to reproduce and grow the population the way that you might be able to if that factor wasn't there, or rather, if that factor was optimum instead. So we call these limits to populations, we call this environmental resistance, that there are all kinds of factors that are going to limit growth. Again, think about the abiotic factors. Think about things like sunlight and water and nutrients for plants. And then for animals, think about their food sources. How are they going to be able to acquire their food sources? Are they going to be able to mate? For plants, is there going to be wind to be able to carry their seed, or do they have to have some other adaptation that allows that to happen? All of these things are factors that are going to work to limit growth, and all of these things together lead us to what we call the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity, and it sounds just like what it is basically what's the maximum population that you can have of that species in that particular habitat. That's the carrying capacity. If it's a habitat that has a ton of all the factors, in other words, it has a low environmental resistance, they can have a really high carrying capacity. If you're starting to run up against that range of tolerance for at least one of the factors, making it a limiting factor, then your carrying capacity is going to be lower. That leads us to a couple of graph terms. Okay, so overall, this would be a good example of a population curve. And so if we started out at some base area, then the population is going to grow. What we find is that in the absence of limits, the populations are going to grow exponentially, okay? Because the more children you have, the more you're able to have more children, okay? Think about that as a positive feedback loop, right? Okay, as you're able to have more children, or as more children are born, then those children have the ability to have more children, and so therefore you're going to have exponential growth here. And then when you get up to your carrying capacity, what we see is that if you go above your carrying capacity, things are going to limit your growth, and so you're going to sort of go through these oscillations here. So we're going to break this curve down into two basic parts. This part over here, the exponential part, we call the J curve. That's the exponential growth. Population is going to increase exponentially. Okay, so you see that it sort of has the shape of a J there, and so that's a J curve. And then if we look at the other part of the graph, that is what we call the S curve. The S curve is the oscillation around the carrying, not the airing, the carrying capacity there. And so the S curve shows that if we go above the carrying capacity, we're going to come back down, and then we can go back up, and so on and so forth, until eventually, hopefully, you reach a point where it sort of levels out and becomes a little bit more stable. So J curve over here, S curve over here on the population graph. Now, if you have drastically overshot your carrying capacity, then what we get is what's termed a population crash, or sometimes you'll hear it called a dieback of certain species. So if it goes way over the carrying capacity, then it's going to crash back down, usually way below the carrying capacity when that happens. There are all kinds of great examples of this. A lot of times when they've reintroduced a species to an area that's been out of it for a while, like say they're reintroducing a deer species or wolves or something like that haven't been there in a while. Since they haven't been there in a while, that environment has sort of adapted to their absence. And so like you put the wolves back, the wolves were out, say, and so let's say that the herbivores that the wolves once fed on, now that the wolves aren't there, their population goes up. And so you've got a lot of food there. And then you reintroduce the wolves, and so the wolves really have a lot of food, and so their population shoots up way past what the area would normally be able to handle. And then, of course, when those food sources run out, their population crashes back down, usually way below their carrying capacity. And this has happened numerous times. A lot of times we reintroduce stuff like wolves, like elk or deer or something like that, that the ecosystem or the habitat has sort of readjusted itself to not having it. And so when it comes back in, then it can really shoot up in population. But obviously if it shoots up too much and uses up its resources, then it's going to crash back down. Of course, you should already be thinking in your head, what applications does this have to humans, and are we overshooting our carrying capacity? And we'll talk a lot more about that later in the year when we talk about human populations specifically. So what plays into this also are reproductive patterns of the species. And so you have some species like insects and bacteria and algae that have a ton of offspring. Their offspring die really quickly. They don't have very long lifespans, and so their reproductive rates are really quick. Like a lot of bacteria, their reproductive rate is like 20 minutes. And so they're going to mature really quickly, they're going to be able to reproduce really quickly, and they're going to make a lot of offspring, not just like, hey, I had a baby, but like we had 1 million babies, okay? Like a ton. So that's one reproductive pattern, sorry guys, that plants and animals can have. And then you can have a reproductive pattern where you might have a lot smaller number of offspring, sometimes later in life, that those offspring are going to mature really slowly. This is particularly true of larger mammals. Sorry, think of like predatory cats or like elephants or like humans, and a lot of birds of prey. They don't have a whole lot of offspring usually, certainly not compared to the stuff like insects, bacteria, and algae. I mean, like, even if we considered like humans having 20 kids, which obviously is somewhat of an anomaly, but that's still a really small number compared to, like, say, the millions that a cockroach could have in, the span of a year or something like that. So that obviously is going to have some pretty drastic effects on the population too, because it's very possible for the species that have a really high reproductive rate to overshoot their carrying capacity really quickly because they don't really have time to adjust. They're getting a lot of population, and then when the food sources are no longer there, then they die off pretty quickly. And that's a good thing because, like, really, bacteria could pretty much cover the whole planet in the matter of a few days, considering their bacteria or their reproductive rate. Except that, of course, they're going to run out of food source in their given area, and so they're going to die back at that point. And so just keep in mind that it's not always the same J curve, that the rate of the J curve sort of depends on the species that you're talking about in that particular case. A couple other quick terms here as we wrap it up. Population density, that's basically how many individuals of that population are in a particular area, and it means just what it sounds like. Density, if we think about it in chemistry terms, it means like how tightly packed together are the atoms. And population density means how tightly packed together are the species in that population. Are there a lot of them in a given area? Are they clumped up and there's a lot of them in an area? Or are there, given a certain area, only a few of them? Like, say, a Bengal tiger that has a really large range, it has a really low population density. As opposed to, like, say, fish in a given area might have a really high population density because there might be hundreds or thousands of them in a relatively small volume. Now, what also leads to some there are different ways that population sizes can vary. There are 4 basic ways that you sort of need to know what they mean. So stable means just what it sounds like, that the population sort of gets up to the carrying capacity, and then it might oscillate a little bit and then sort of levels out and stays there, that the food sources and the resources are fairly consistent. You can have an eruptive variation in population, which basically means that it goes through these, it basically comes to a point where it blows up and then it's probably going to die off really quickly. And so it's not very stable. It gets really high and then it's going to go back down because you've probably overshot the carrying capacity. We have cyclic variations, which means just what it sounds like, that it's going to oscillate, that maybe your S curve is going to sort of continue, that it's going to go up for a while, it's going to go down for a while, and then go back up, and it's going to sort of keep going in that sort of sinusoidal pattern of the S curve. And there are a couple of things that are going to play into really the cyclic, but really all of them. You could have top-down variations in your cyclic, meaning that you have predators that are sort of controlling that. So you've got, if your deer population goes up a lot, then the wolves, there's more deer for the wolves to eat, so you get more wolves, and they're going to keep the population down by eating the deer. And then you could have a bottom up, meaning that, like, the resources actually start to die out. Now, that could have been the resource was the deer for the wolves, or it could have been like the food sources for the deer, that dies out, or it's overeaten or whatever, and so that's going to lead to a die-off of some of the deer. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean a sharp population crash. Again, it could be just sort of that cyclical pattern near the carrying capacity. And then our last variation is irregular, and again, that means just what it sounds like, that you can't really predict it, that sometimes the population is really high and sometimes the population is low, and it could be due to disease, it could be due to invasive species or something like that, but it's not that we can sort of predict it like we can a cyclical one, that it's not a stable pattern and there's not just like one big eruption and then it goes back down. That sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but it doesn't seem to be going in a stable cycle. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some good insight into populations. And again, we're going to go into this in much greater detail when we talk about humans in our units that we do next semester.